In mid-July, a group of South Sudanese soldiers broke into what was supposed to be a secure compound in Juba and raped several humanitarian workers. It lasted several hours, and UN peacekeepers stationed nearby are accused of ignoring calls for help. The incident has helped to highlight the particular danger of sexual violence faced by people, and especially women, working within the humanitarian community. Randolph Nogel has more.
Peace in South Sudan exists only on paper. Fighting between government and rebel forces broke out in July, less than a year after a peace deal was signed. Rebel leader Riek Machar, who had joined a unity government, fled the country. During 4 days of fighting, 36,000 civilians were displaced, more than 300 people killed, and an unknown number of women and children raped. Both sides have been accused of using rape as a weapon throughout South Sudan's civil war.
Please, I beg the international community to see what is happening in our country, okay? Because this one is too much for us.
On the last day of fighting in July, South Sudanese troops carried out one of the worst attacks against foreign aid workers in the 3-year conflict. They broke through the gates of a hotel compound and gang raped several foreign aid workers. UN peacekeepers, based less than 2 kilometers away, didn't respond. The US Embassy didn't either.
Here in South Sudan, looting, attacks, threats and harassment are a daily occurrence. The heinous attack on Terrain Hotel on July the 11th was an egregious assault on humanitarians and needs to be repeatedly and loudly condemned, and the perpetrators brought to justice.
The UN has launched an investigation into whether its peacekeepers ignored calls for help. South Sudan is one of the most dangerous places in the world for aid workers. At least 59, most of them Sudanese, have been killed since the conflict in South Sudan began in December of 2013. A war that has left the world's youngest country divided and its most vulnerable people exposed to sexual brutality, along with those trying to help them. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Geneva is Megan Nobert, the founder and director of Report the Abuse. Her organization has just published a report on NGO structures to prevent sexual attacks against their staff. Megan, thank you very much for joining us. How important is it to you for you to speak out and recount the experience that you went through?
I think it becomes increasingly vital given the latest news about another attack on humanitarian workers. My own experience was slightly different in that I was attacked by a colleague, but regardless, any attack against aid workers is important and must be spoken about.
The UN has launched an inquiry into allegations about that incident in South Sudan, that peacekeepers did not prevent abuse and sexual violence against civilians and foreigners in Juba. Do you believe that peacekeepers in general have been failing to do their job?
In South Sudan, absolutely. There have been a number of incidences reported publicly, as well as those known more accurately in South Sudan, where they have stood by and watched individuals, primarily civilians, be attacked, be gang raped, be dragged away.
Do you think?
I genuinely believe the peacekeepers in South Sudan are failing people.
Right. So you have the UN sending 4,000 more peacekeepers. So they seem to think that if they increase the numbers, then things might get better. But it's about something else, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's not about the numbers, it's about how they're being used and the willingness to act when atrocities are being witnessed.
If an aid worker wrote to you and said, I want to go to South Sudan, and let's say it's a woman who says, I want to go to South Sudan and I want to help, would you advise me to go? And what advice would you give me?
So I've actually been getting this question quite a bit over the last few months, but increasingly so in the last few weeks. And it's a hard question to answer because on the one hand, the people of South Sudan are incredibly vulnerable. particularly the women and children, and we must, as humanitarian workers, be there to do what we can for the local population. That is our purpose. That's what we do. That's our job. It's a profession, and that is our job. On the other hand, it is becoming increasingly dangerous as a female in particular to be operating in South Sudan. And my response is ask your organization what they have in place should something go wrong. And not just an act of sexual violence, although that is an important question to ask. But what are their evacuation plans more generally? What is their medical evacuation plans given a fairly uneven access to medical care throughout the country? What will you do for me? What can you do for me? And if you can't do something, what measures do you have in place?
You've been talking to organizations. Have they been listening?
Questions and being honest.
Yeah, have organizations been listening to you?
Actually, absolutely. I've actually been I was quite surprised by how overwhelmingly positive organizations have been as we've been speaking to them over the last year. I think it's a question of timing. And there is a movement, a momentum in the industry right now to talk about issues that are difficult. Sexual violence against and within the humanitarian development community being one of those issues. Now, the response has been positive. I think we need to acknowledge the fact that it's also an issue that organizations can't really say they're not behind. Any organization that says sexual violence against my employees is in no way important to me, or I don't care if it happens, that's going to be setting up quite a difficult situation. So they have to say that they care. Whether this will translate into action, I think, is the more important question, and we are seeing some positive signs. When we were doing the research for the report we released on the 19th of August, I think it was 9% of organizations did in fact note that they had zero policies, procedures, response strategies, nothing in place to address sexual violence against either their employees or against the local population. And that's, I mean, first of all, it makes an organization incredibly vulnerable to admit that. But every organization that did admit that said, we are actively working on addressing it. Now that we've identified this gap, we do want to fill it. So there is absolutely, I think there is a movement right now to start addressing some of these issues. And again, the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive.
And looking at what might be a more difficult conundrum, besides addressing organizations, when we look at the governments involved, so with the South Sudanese government, these were South Sudanese soldiers. They said, you know, they've already executed a couple of them. These were rogue soldiers. They didn't follow, you know, orders or chain of command. How difficult is it then if you have an incident like the one at that hotel where those aid workers were raped? How difficult is it to then engage with a government whose soldiers were responsible for this when they're saying nothing to do with us, just a bunch of rotten apples?
It's incredibly difficult. That's where states who have a stake in peace processes like those going on in South Sudan should be stepping up and pushing for there to be real accountability. There was a number of incidents that have happened in South Sudan over the last few years, including in the last insurrection. There was attacks on WFP's food banks. Incredible amount of food was stolen. There has been massive attacks against local population and attacks against civilians, against humanitarian aid workers. It's time for governments to step in and start pushing for there to be change. That's not necessarily for the organizations themselves, because I think that makes it difficult for a humanitarian or development organization to approach a government on that kind of a matter, because it can jeopardize being able to provide services to the local population. So that's where governments need to be stepping in.
Okay, Megan, unfortunately, we have run out of time. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Megan Nobert, joining us there.